Hello, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for the launch of the 2023 State and Trends of Carbon Pricing report. Launching this report as part of I4C has become a bit of a tradition, and the reason for that is because we at the World Bank think carbon pricing is important to achieve our climate goals. And why is that? Because without a price on carbon, polluting is free. And carbon pricing is critical to internalize this externality and to channel investments to where money should really flow, both private and public sector investments. Now, there are varied CPI instruments, direct instruments, indirect instruments, and as part of a broader policy package, carbon pricing really has the potential to help achieve broader sustainability and development goals. Beyond this report, the World Bank Group supports client countries on various CPI instruments, including via the Partnership for Market Implementation program. And today's session will have three parts. First, Jennifer Serra, who you met earlier today, will come on stage and provide welcoming remarks. Then my colleague Joe Pryor, who's the principal author of the report, will give us an overview of the key insights of this year's report. And then lastly, I'll be joined by Stefano De Clara and Katie Sullivan from ICAP and AITA, respectively, to just have a chat about state and trends of carbon pricing. So without further ado, Jennifer.
So thank you so much, Hania. And Hania didn't introduce herself. Hania Dawood is our manager for finance and economics. And Hania and her team put this whole event together. So congratulations and thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back up on stage again today to launch this year's State and Trends Carbon Pricing Report. And it's our annual publication, and it provides a summary of major developments in carbon pricing from around the world. And we're pretty excited about this year because we've been working on carbon markets for decades. But in this report, in its current format, it's its 10th edition. So happy birthday, happy 10th birthday to the report. A lot has changed over the past decades. In 2003, the report largely focused on carbon markets emerging from the Kyoto Protocol using the flexibility mechanisms, but it has since evolved to increasingly focus on how governments have used domestic pricing mechanisms to incorporate climate costs into domestic production, consumption, and investment decisions. So there's three things I find really interesting and exciting about this year's report. The first, despite the challenging economic and geopolitical circumstances under which we're all living right now, governments are still continuing to prioritize policies to price carbon. So that's good news. Price carbon, price pollution. The approaches may vary, but the overall trend points to a direct signal to reduce emissions covering now almost a quarter of global emissions are covered from some kind of a carbon pricing mechanism, and that's up from 7% from 10 years ago. So that's more than a threefold increase. Second, these policies generated a record high revenue of $95 billion in the past year. So that's a real signal of the potential for carbon taxes and emission trading systems to raise revenue. And in addition to driving innovation and helping deliver on broader sustainability and development goals. And third, we're starting to see much more interest in international carbon markets, with increasing levels of cooperation between countries on carbon markets under Article 6, including announcements of the first projects to generate authorized emission reductions under Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement. Now, across all of these findings, what governments are doing, the revenues they're raising, and international cooperation, we want to see much, much more action. And for instance, increases in coverage and in the price level will be key to unlock the full potential of carbon markets. But the broader trend is positive, and this is heartening, especially given the economic and fiscal headwinds many governments face today. Throughout I4C 2023, in the next few days, we'll be looking at some of these challenges and examine how carbon markets can deliver for countries And tomorrow's plenary session will really focus on that. But for now, let's begin by understanding the current global context of carbon pricing through an in-depth look at the findings of this report. So let me turn it over to Joe Pryor, the main author leading the team on this report. So thank you so much, Joe.
Thank you, Jennifer. Now I'm going to give a very brief overview of the State and Trends report. But before I do, I wanted to give a big thanks to all of those who made this report possible, particularly the World Bank team, but also the experts from Adelphi and Ecologic Institute, as well as our partners in International Carbon Action Partnership and Ecosystem Marketplace, as well as the governments and organisations that contributed the data that underpin the State and Trends report. Now to talk a little bit about some of the findings, and this is a map of the carbon taxes and ETSs, which has become a regular feature of the State and Trends report. And what we see is that as of 1st of April this year, there are around 73 carbon taxes and emissions trading systems currently in operation. And that accounts for about a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions. And as Jennifer mentioned, it's been a challenging year. So I think that one of the key takeaways is that despite this challenging circumstances, we've seen governments maintain and even implement additional or new carbon pricing instruments, and probably the most significant of which is the introduction or the launch of Indonesia's emissions trading system, which covers the coal-fired power sector. So in terms of prices, we've seen varied trends, but I guess slightly upwards. And about half of all carbon pricing instruments experienced nominal price increases over the year. But this is not consistent across all jurisdictions. And we saw some with drops, including the Korean ETS, which prices fell about 35% or closer to 40% after accounting for inflation. So what we see is that prices have varied and generally prices remain below the levels required to achieve the Paris Agreement goals. And this is a useful chart that shows a few different things. First of all, it shows the variances in prices across those jurisdictions that have implemented carbon pricing. It also shows the variances in coverage with the intensity of the colour showing how much of the emissions are covered in the jurisdiction. The other thing I wanted to point out is this grey band in the middle, and this represents the inflation-adjusted price recommended by the High-Level Commission on Carbon Pricing on the carbon price that's required by 2030 to achieve the Paris Agreement goals. And what we see is that less than 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions are covered by a price at or above those recommended levels. So just to switch to carbon crediting, and what we've seen in the last, the clickers, can you do it manually up the back? Thank you. So what we've seen in terms of carbon credit issuances is that there's been a slight decline compared to 2021. But this trend isn't consistent across all types of credits. We've seen credits from independent crediting mechanisms decline from their all-time highs in 2021, whereas credits from Clean Development Mechanism have actually increased and now represent 30% or about a third of global issuances. Still not the same as the heights back in the Kyoto era, but returning to increase in terms of its global contribution. Next slide, please. In terms of prices for carbon crediting mechanisms, we've seen significant declines. There we go. And this is true for all types of crediting mechanisms, but particularly noticeable for nature-based credits. And we saw declines in not just prices, but also in terms of issuances and retirements. And this graph displays the prices of exchange-traded credits. And so while the trends are quite clear for these, the trends for over-the-counter credit prices is not so clear. And in fact, some market participants have reported in fact, increases in the last year. And I think this could point to a few things, but one thing it suggests is that participants in the voluntary carbon market are willing to pay a premium for credits with certain types of attributes. So I wanted to leave with 3 takeaways, notwithstanding the fact that there's still a long way to go, that as Jennifer mentioned, prices need to increase and coverage needs to expand. But I want to leave with 3 positive takeaways. The first is that despite significantly challenging times, we've seen a persistence and a resilience in how governments are retaining and adopting carbon pricing. I think this is in stark contrast to what we've seen in previous difficult economic times. And Jennifer pointed to the fact that stepping back a bit, you can see that we've actually come a long way. So in the 10 years that we've been tracking these types of instruments, we've seen global coverage grow from around 7% to about 23% today. And carbon revenues have increased to be almost $100 billion in 2022. The second point I wanted to emphasize is that we've seen increasing interest from emerging economies considering adopting carbon pricing. And this is an interesting development, and the drivers behind this extend beyond just climate change, that economies are looking to use carbon pricing to achieve broader objectives, including as a fiscal tool. And then the last thing I just wanted to finish on was that now more than ever highlights the need to be able to track climate policies in general and carbon pricing in particular. And the work, not just by the World Bank, but also by other organisations in tracking this information is critical to help policymakers understand, well, what are the instruments that are in place, what are those design features, and what are the results? How does that impact on the metrics that we're tracking? So with that, I'd like to hand over to Hanya. But one last plug, that the report is now available, so please download it and have a look. But all the data that underpins the report is available on the carbon pricing dashboard. So thanks, Hanya.
Great, Joe. Thank you very much for a fantastic presentation. Very delighted to have with us Stefano De Clara from ICAP. ICAP, for those of you who don't know, brings together more than 40 governments interested in facilitating learning and dialogue around carbon pricing and in particular ETS systems. And Katie Sullivan is with us from IETA. She's managing director there, focused on climate and sustainability. And both ICAP and IETA are very important partners for our work in this area and beyond. So first, reactions. Did anything surprise you from what Joe shared? Stefano.
So first of all, I mean, congratulations to the World Bank for organizing this event, but also in particular to Joe and the team for producing such an amazing report. I mean, needless to say, it is a key resource for anyone working on carbon pricing and that market, and it is something that we use almost on a daily basis in our day-to-day work. So well done on putting out the newest edition of that. We did as ICAP, we do a similar report that focuses on ETS more specifically, and I think we also came to really similar conclusions, not surprisingly. So one thing worth noting is that we really came a long way over the last decade. If you just look at emission trading systems implementation, the number of ETSs in force around the world more than doubled over the last decade. The emissions they cover, so the quantity of global emissions that are under an ETS cap, almost doubled over the last decade, and seeing this expansion is really encouraging, and it is the direction of travel we should go towards. And then, coming out from a year such as 2022, I think a key message that Joe also highlighted is the resilience that emission trading systems, but also carbon taxes showed to what was an unprecedented year. characterized by the first ever global energy crisis, and being where we are today, I don't think could be taken for granted. And I don't think that many people expected carbon pricing instruments as a whole to weather such a year so well.
So more coverage and momentum despite challenges, economic challenges. Katie, any surprises?
Thanks, Hania. Well, to echo Stefano, well done. First of all, it's an honor to be here at the launch. And I was fortunate enough to participate virtually at the launch last year. But this is really a cornerstone key document. Every year, AIDA, our community, many market practitioners, many governments, civil society, they all use this and wait with anticipation for it to be released because it can get outdated really quickly. But it is so valuable, the content of everything that is existing or under development. I feel like in recent years, digging more into like the trends that we are seeing, obviously the Article 6 hook and more and more attention being paid to voluntary carbon market, which is really important. I think some of the more kind of granularity around the project type developments that are occurring, you had pointed it out on removals, right, what we're seeing there and the premiums associated with possible tagging. The list goes on. One thing that Stefano and I were laughing at was, laughing at in an endearing way, no stripes. There are no more stripes on the map. And we welcome that. It's a very busy, active map, but there are no stripes on that map, so maybe more easily digestible, let's say, to a broader group of stakeholders that aren't necessarily in the trenches on carbon pricing like some of us are. Great, thank you. So Stefano, back to you. So at ICAP, you focus on ETS systems, but as we know, we have direct pricing instruments, carbon taxes, ETS systems, carbon crediting systems. We have a whole other universe of indirect carbon pricing, excise taxes, fossil fuel subsidies. How do you think about the pros and cons of different direct carbon pricing instruments? And in your mind, when is an ETS system effective?
Good, and I guess we can spend hours talking about this, but without getting too, academic about it, I think, the pros of carbon taxes is that they're relatively easy to implement and administer and relatively straightforward. Arguably governments know fairly well how to do taxes, and consumers and covered entities also know how to react to taxes. Crediting mechanisms are flexible. You can apply them in any geography, almost any sector, so they're really good at expanding the reach of carbon pricing outside of compliance territory. But then, the main pro of emission trading systems, which is also the main thing that taxes and crediting lacks, is that they combine a price on carbon with a fixed cap on emissions that declines over time, and that is the essential feature because you can really control, cap control, and put your emissions on a pathway that goes to net zero around mid-century.
Great, thank you, Stefano. And one thing that we've been discussing at the World Bank quite a bit is with the developments around Article 6, some of these carbon pricing instruments are being looked at as a tool to channel and mobilize climate finance as opposed to just achieve mitigation goals. Katie, so AITA represents businesses. You have a membership of over 150 members. Raising carbon prices, whether by imposing a carbon tax or mandating purchases of carbon offsets, it's expensive. It's a direct hit to P&L. Why do your constituents care about this?
Yeah, and well, even in the last year and a half, 2 years, we've actually grown, Hania. So we've doubled. We're over 300 members now across sectors, across borders. A lot of that pushes certainly the inevitability. If you look at Europe, parts of Asia, North America, you had carbon pricing, legislation, regulation happening, or it was inevitable that it'll come soon in many of those jurisdictions. And you also, though, more recently, a lot of these corporates are taking on their own target and quite serious on these targets and recognizing the need to lean into markets. They're also committing billions upon billions of dollars earmarked for climate investments. In fact, it's more a matter of like capital is mobile and they're looking for destination zones right now. So with AIDA, and it's again a testament to the report that has been released where they're looking for the current state of play, right? The landscape of all these different jurisdictional developments, compliance pricing or pre-compliance, at national, subnational, possibly internationally, right? The voluntary marketplace, possibly, the interaction. So there is a lot of money out there that private sector is committed, that they're looking for those destination zones. And information is absolutely key to that whole process and the evolution. Now, pricing, it's important. We do believe that lower prices are really critical to this because it's going to cost a lot of money. So making sure that there's cost containment, flexibility, these options around trading to keep costs low while still in a measurable way reaching your greenhouse gas reduction target is really vital.
Great. So fear of Uncle Sam, but also a lot of companies are voluntarily choosing to buy sometimes very expensive carbon credits, especially we're seeing some of the tech companies buying several $100s worth of credits for technological carbon removal. One follow-up question for each of you. For Stefano, what is one development that you've seen in the last couple of years that in your mind really made an impact in carbon pricing?
Again, like looking more specifically at the world of emission trading systems, I think we are starting to see signs of this, but it will really be something that will play out over the coming years as well. And that is, on one hand, the sectoral expansion of carbon pricing and specifically emission trading instruments that are starting to cover more and more sectors, and that is something that we need to apply carbon price to a broader and broader part of the economy. And at the same time, that is also often associated with the alignment process with where emission trading systems are today with the long-term trajectory needed to reach net zero, which in most cases also has to do with understanding what kind of role and design carbon pricing, but emission trading systems more specifically can have in that context. And that is something that we have to get serious about in the coming years, because that process will have to start really soon.
Thank you, Stefano. And slight variation to this question, Katie, what is one development that you wish to see in the next year that you really think will unlock the potential of carbon markets?
Only one? Okay. I think progress around, so we're heading into really important bond negotiations with the SBSTA talks, and Article 6.4 supervisory body has a lot on the docket to discuss. And then Dubai, there will be some really important decisions made around Article 6, giving a bit more clarity on some guidance with corresponding adjustments in the 6.4 mechanism, the new mechanism, possible line of sight into some methodologies, and hopefully then more confidence to see even more countries with business support lean into Article 6 arrangements, bilaterals, and MOUs. So I think that's really important. It's also kind of a discrete glide path over the coming months to watch out for, but I'll keep it at that. There are others, but.
Great, fantastic. Well, we have a few questions from the audience. Let me go to Joe. How does State and Trends report calculate global emissions coverage?
So it's a good question. It's basically done based on the amount of emissions in each jurisdiction with a carbon price and the proportion of those emissions that are covered, and that's the numerator, and then the denominator in the equation is total greenhouse gas emissions. For all of these, we use EDGAR database, which has constantly been updated and refined, and which is also based on other data sources such as IEA. But interestingly, they're becoming more granular, and that's allowing us to improve the type of granularity that we're able to show. We're hoping to have developments in this over the coming up, and working with ICAP and others on being able to have more granularity in how we display global coverage.
So an important and difficult question, what role, and maybe to everyone on the panel, what role does indirect or implicit carbon price play in the global trends on carbon pricing?
I'm happy to go first.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to recognize the underlying incentive in an economy. I think that understanding not just the direct carbon pricing, but also the indirect carbon pricing. When we talk about indirect carbon pricing, it's things like fuel excise taxes, differentials in value-added taxes. And understanding this helps understand what that incentive is in the economy. So it's important to be able to know the level of fuel excise tax and how that transpires into that incentive. It's particularly important because many countries, particularly those emerging economies and developing countries, have an understanding of and experience in implementing those types of policies. So fuel excise is a classic example. So being able to leverage those existing policies is really powerful in being able to try to apply a carbon price in those economies.
Yeah. And fully agree with Joe. Maybe just adding real quick. I mean, indirect carbon pricing does have a really important role and effects also for the functioning of direct carbon pricing. And you don't see it because these policies don't generate a clear price signal on carbon, but they can really affect the way that direct carbon pricing can work. They can reinforce the explicit carbon price if they work in tandem with them, maybe in different sectors or for specific technologies. But they can also mute the explicit carbon price signal if you're talking about fossil fuel subsidies or things that generate an opposite implicit price on carbon that deducts what carbon pricing actually does.
Yeah, I mean, in some, it distorts the pricing signal.
Exactly.
So a lot of questions on voluntary carbon markets. Maybe for Katie, what are the main headwinds or challenges for voluntary carbon markets moving forward?
I'm very happy that that question was asked because I could only choose one in your earlier question of what to watch for this year. And so the voluntary carbon market, too, there's obviously a lot of movement. There's a lot of activity. For context, it is still quite small compared to the compliance systems, right, just to keep that. But it is growing, and there's a lot of interest across our 300 plus members now. The majority of those are interested in tracking closely the voluntary space. I would say within the next few months, keeping a watch on further guidance, publications from the 2 global voluntary carbon market integrity initiatives will be critical. And you had Marissa in the previous panel that touched on this a bit, but it's really important. There's a bit of a gray area. It's a lot of uncertainty still that are boiling over, including on overlapping guidance on the voluntary market space. So having, on the supply side, the Integrity Council on the voluntary carbon market, the ICVCM, come up with their next batch of assessment framework and steps, and then on the demand side, the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative come out. Their launch date is the 28th of June for provisional claims. This is on the claim side of things. Is going to be, I think, very, very important. People are hungry to see that information from these global integrity initiatives.
Great. Well, I would like to make one announcement. To download the report, scan the QR code on the back of your badge, and you'll find it. You'll find it there. So one important question. Joe, you mentioned that you're seeing increase in coverage for carbon pricing in emerging markets. What is driving that trend?
So I think that there are a range of things. And in fact, we had a PMI workshop yesterday where we heard varying drivers across different jurisdictions where for many jurisdictions it is climate mitigation. And that's understandable. But we've also heard that using carbon pricing as a fiscal policy and to raise revenue is another driver. And there are other drivers as well in terms of like sustainability benefits and things like that. But those are the 2 that we've definitely been hearing about, and particularly noting that the revenue has increased to around almost $100 billion. It's quite significant.
Looking at carbon crediting activity, we saw that while independent crediting mechanisms still dominate supply, issuances from CDM have surged more and more as countries are considering establishing domestic crediting mechanisms. What factors are driving this trend?
Do you want to go?
I mean, I'll quickly go for it, even though it's not fully related to ICAP's work. And I think I wouldn't have the same reading about that. And without going into the technicalities, I think the 2020s and 2021 was a tricky time for the CDM because there was a lack of guidance, and for some time its functioning was almost on hold. And I think the increase in issuance that we saw last year is mainly because additional clarity came out from Glasgow and then Sharm el-Sheikh, and now you have a bit of a backlog of things coming to market. I don't think it is really related to more and more governments looking at domestic crediting instruments, which is also happening, but for different reasons, I think.
Great. Back to voluntary carbon markets, Katie. There's a question around the benefits to the community of voluntary carbon credits. What, in your view, how's that going? What more should be done to really ensure that communities benefit from the potential growth of this space?
Yeah, it's so important, and not that there haven't been wonderful projects that have direct community benefits over the years, including when things were quite nascent and there wasn't as much scrutiny on the voluntary carbon market. Communications was never the biggest talent, let's say, of the community. I think, though, it's really important that there is more of a magnifying glass to ensure that the monies are going directly to the communities. And those integrity initiatives that I mentioned earlier, there is definitely a link to environment and social safeguards, right, and community indigenous engagement, also just empowerment through all steps of the life cycle process of these projects, from start to when the monetization goes directly into the communities. This is not just simply, how do I put this, a mitigation play anymore. This is not just about greenhouse gas reductions or even removals. Like, the community aspect of it is as important, if not frankly more important. And that goes beyond just the voluntary carbon market, right? For all these crediting mechanisms. And when you have just these local, very real local impacts to ensure that it can actually be, measurable, the benefits to biodiversity and health and jobs and everything else beyond the climate piece, it is critical for this to actually have the buy-in and support over the long run that we need.
Yeah. Another difficult questions, voluntary carbon markets, compliance markets, Article 6 markets, how will these interact?
How much time do we have?
4 minutes.
So I'll go first. I think we do see that it's a messy market. That it's very difficult to define these discrete segments, and particularly in, just to give examples, like independent crediting mechanisms are often used in the voluntary carbon market, as well as being used in compliance markets, for example, in South Africa and Colombia. So it's not these discrete markets. And then similarly, on the international carbon markets and domestic compliance markets, you see the likes of Singapore looking to, from in the next year or so, start to incorporate and allow international credits to be used, not only for their domestic compliance, but also to help meet their NDC. So it's definitely, it's a messy world. And what I think that means is that over time, you'll start to see these markets starting to converge. And I think that ties into an earlier question about what is the biggest challenge for the voluntary carbon market? And I think that's probably it. How does it remain relevant, and how does it interact with these other sort of compliance requirements?
Maybe just adding real quick, and I fully agree with what Joe said. I think we're in a relatively messy and uncharted territory right now, but I think things will converge almost by nature going forward. Because if you fast forward 20 years and if you try to imagine how things will have to look like as we get closer to 2050, compliance markets and compliance obligations will expand, meaning that they will start to blend more and more with what is now occupied by the voluntary market territory. And at the same time, both compliance instruments and voluntary instruments will have to progressively shift from a reduction-based, marketplace to removals-based marketplace. And to some extent, also compliance instruments will need to make use of increasing amounts of removals. And that is where, things that are now covered purely under the voluntary market will come in terms of possibly removal credits being used for compliance almost, everywhere. If you are really to balance leftover emissions with removals and get to net zero.
That's a good point. And the removal space is, it's fascinating. It's really active now. A lot of the learnings, innovations are occurring in the voluntary market, but many governments are looking to adapt, if not full on adopt. I will mention a plug with AIDA as well. We put it more as like an inflection period, right? Messy period, but an inflection period. It's an important time. We as a community are even trying to develop our own shared vision for what this space looks like, convergence or parallel lanes of these markets going forward. I will put a plug into just the infrastructure piece to this and how much hats off to the World Bank, right, and our partners with Singapore and AIDA with the Climate Action Data Trust. We'll learn more about that over the next couple of days. But having this global public good metadata layer that allows for the interoperability, at the very least, across all these core foundational pieces of infrastructure, the registry, the tracking systems, to avoid double counting, to have a line of sight into what are reductions or removals from voluntary, what standards, project type. So Article 6, corresponding adjustments, I think that's a very tangible, practical piece that is evolving right now that will hopefully facilitate this journey that we're all on together.
Great, thank you, Katie. I think a great place to wrap up, and maybe I'll end with my own plug. There are several sessions about the Climate Action Data Trust that Katie mentioned, so please visit. In addition to supporting our client countries with capacity building and advisory around their domestic carbon pricing instruments, we're also really leaning in and engaging in supporting the build out of carbon markets infrastructure through our Climate Warehouse program. And the final plug is download the report. A lot more fantastic information. Thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you, Joe and the team, for a fantastic job.
Thank you.